Yeah. Olnea. February 2nd, 1940. In December, the Finns had humiliated the invading Soviet Red Army in the field, but throughout January, the Soviets had been planning and organizing for a massive new assault. This week, that assault begins. I'm Indy Neidell. This is World War II. Last week, the British made a strong step on the road to cracking Enigma, the complex German encoding system. The Russians continued their military buildup in Karelia, the French were bored of inaction in the West, and the Germans were restructuring their economy. They were also still making war plans, of course. On the 27th, the German plans for invading Norway become more formal. It now has the name Weserübung, referring to the river Weser and exercise, so Operation Weser Exercise. Back in December, Admiral Erich Raeder had brought Vidkun Quisling to meet Hitler. Quisling is the head of the pro-Nazi movement, a small one, in Norway, and he helped convince Hitler how vital occupying Norway is. Raeder is worried that a British presence in southern Norway might cut off the Baltic, but there had actually been British plans afoot for more than that. Operation Catherine. This was First Lord of the Admiralty Winston Churchill's plan for super armored battleships to launch an offensive into the Baltic Sea. Seriously, Churchill wanted to send in 3 Revenge-class battleships, flotillas of cruisers and destroyers, submarines, an aircraft carrier, the whole 9 yards. The battleships, the Sovereign, the Revenge, and the Resolution, would need to be modified though, since the Baltic waters are shallower than the Atlantic. The ships would become slower than they were now, which was already the slowest capital ships in the Royal Navy since they'd been laid down before World War I. But in the narrow channels of the Baltic, that wouldn't matter, and their 15-inch batteries could outshoot German capital ships like Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, at least until Germany's 15-inch gun battleships Bismarck and Tirpitz could be completed and commissioned into the German Navy. Churchill saw a window of opportunity and envisioned these to be armored turtles. And that's important, the armor. Churchill thought an attack by air or by torpedo was the biggest danger to the squadron. So they'd have hundreds of tons of extra deck armor and big bulbous blisters added to the hulls to absorb torpedo explosions. They would also be bristling with AA guns. Remember, the Luftwaffe's bombing skills have not yet impressed anybody too much. And the goals? Cut off Germany's iron imports from Sweden, tie down German warships, convince Sweden and Norway to join the Allies, and intimidate the USSR. Churchill has a habit of advocating naval maneuvers away from the battlefronts. It was he who had been the strongest advocate for breaking the Dardanelles and the Gallipoli landings in World War I. He's also mechanically creative and was one of the earliest advocates of the first tank prototypes. Opposition to Catherine came from Admiral Sir Dudley Pound, First Sea Lord. Well, it came from a lot of people, but particularly from him. Armor plating was not something that they just had hundreds of tons of sitting around. Pound also thought Churchill was underestimating the value of air power, especially with the ships moving so slowly in such confined spaces so close to Germany. And if disaster happened and the fleet was lost, Italy or Japan might join the war on Germany's side. Churchill didn't help his cause either by ordering the completion of the first King George-class battleships before Germany could get Bismarck and Tirpitz ready for action, since they used the same steel armor plates that Operation Catherine also required. He'd been pushing for this operation since September, but on January 20th, the plans were finally shelved. We've mentioned before other Allied plans for interfering with Germany's iron imports, which partly involve possibly sending troops to help the Finns in the Winter War. They might be too late for that, though. On the 29th, in diplomatic exchanges in Sweden, the Soviets indicate that they are willing to negotiate peace with the legitimate Finnish government of Risto Ryti. So they no longer support the puppet Kuusinen regime. What this says is that the war, while still raging in the field, is no longer a war to introduce Soviet communism into Finland, but a war about borders and fortifications, much as what the Soviet demands had ostensibly been about a few months ago. Still, Round 2 of the fighting for the Karelian Isthmus begins this week. As I've said, the Soviet Red Army has been reorganizing, retraining, and rethinking tactics all month under General Timoshenko after the disasters in December, and the blow now falls. The plan is to ramp up the artillery day after day until a huge and sudden escalation February 1st, when airstrikes also hit the Finns, followed by localized ground attacks. This is not an attempt at a big breakthrough, though. The plan for that is for the 11th, after pounding the Finns relentlessly around the clock. Factored into Timoshenko's equation was a savage but simple truth. Russian units could be rotated, Finnish units could not. The cumulative strain on the defenders was designed to grind them down not only physically, but psychologically by depriving them of sleep, warmth, hope itself. Eventually, even Finns would reach their breaking point. The Finns know exactly what is coming, but they can't really do much to prevent it. Their artillery shell shortage is so acute that batteries have orders only to fire when under direct ground attacks. Their air force can, in theory, strafe Soviet supply columns, but the Soviet Polikarpov interceptors make that a seriously risky proposition. They do send a recon plane through on the morning of the 1st that manages a photo shoot of the Soviet lines opposite the Suma defensive position. When they look at the photos, they are shocked to find that overnight, I mean literally overnight, the Soviet artillery has nearly doubled to 200 big guns. And this is just the visible, uncamouflaged guns against that one position. Well, later that day, the guns begin to blast while 500 planes begin the carpet bombing of Suma, which William Trotter points out is the heaviest and most sustained aerial attack in history to this point. The Finnish defenses shatter under the continued onslaught. Phone cables are destroyed. Men are buried alive. Field kitchens can only be used at night, and the smoke from any fire for warmth summons a barrage. So forget about food and warmth. But the Russians are still doing one thing now that they had done in December, taking staggering losses. See, the attacks on the 1st have the pattern: artillery and air, and then infantry and tanks come in, with the infantry assembling, approaching, and charging in the open in dense columns. Finnish machine guns just mow down the Russians, but this time, doesn't matter. Wave after wave of fresh troops will come on, 5 or 6 waves a day, no matter what the cost. That's the plan. 100 tanks would attack in a wedge, this time working closely with the infantry. So it's now suicidal for the Finns to send out anti-tank squads. And the Finns don't have enough anti-tank weaponry to even approach handling the advancing tanks. The 1st is a day of non-stop fighting, but, and this is important, the attacks are still really only probing attacks to wear down the Finns day after day until the 11th. On February 2nd, the pattern of attack is repeated, only now heavier and on a wider front as the week ends. And the month of January has just ended, of course. For that month, German U-boats sink 40 ships for 111,200 tons, with the biggest successes in the North Sea, especially near the Moray Firth. German Admiral Karl Dönitz has only 32 operational U-boats at the moment, though, so only 6 to 8 can really be on patrol at any one time. Also at the end of January, Reinhard Heydrich appoints Adolf Eichmann as head of Department 4, D4 in Berlin. The designation will change many times and will simply become known over time as the Eichmann-Referat or Judenreferat, Eichmann's department to handle the Jewish question. For now, they are to complete the deportation of Jews from the areas Germany has annexed and will be responsible for all future such deportations, both provenance and destination. And one last note. A record budget is presented in the Japanese Diet February 1st. Almost half is for the military, weaponry, and training. We'll talk more about Japan next week. This week, though, has come to its end, with the renewal of heavy Soviet hostilities on the ground in Karelia, German plans proceeding for an invasion of Norway, British plans for the Baltic being scrapped, and Japan planning to spend ever more on its military. Japan doesn't just need military for its war with China, Their puppet state of Manchukuo shares a pretty long border with the USSR. And though there's been a ceasefire in effect since September, that's not the same thing as peace. Could the Soviet Union handle a two-front war with both Finland and Japan? Would they? I don't see why not. And you know why? Because the Red Army is quite clear that its plan against the Finns is to just throw men after men at them, men who die by the thousands until victory is achieved. It's hard for me to even wrap my head around the brutality of such a plan, but if they can do it against the Finns, I bet they could do it against another enemy. If you want to understand more about how the world came to a point where it was acceptable to some to organize ethnic relocations as a state matter, have a look at our Between Two Wars episode about the Greco-Turkish War right here. Our Patreon supporter of the week is Fernando Lopez Ojeda. Like Fernando, you should join the Time Ghost Army on Patreon. Every dollar makes this show better and better. The war effort needs you. See you next time.